Some war films weren't banned for violence, they were banned for something far more dangerous. These films didn't show battlefields, they showed what happened after the battles. The parts history books rarely linger on. For years they were cut, restricted, or quietly removed from theatres. Not because they were inaccurate, but because they asked questions no government, no army, and no audience was ready to answer. Watching them today feels different, uncomfortable, almost forbidden. And once you understand why these films disappeared, you start to realise something unsettling. Some truths about war were never meant to survive. Number 5. Paths of Glory, 1957. At first glance, Paths of Glory doesn't look like a typical banned war film. There are no graphic battle sequences, no overwhelming spectacle, no lingering shots designed to shock. And that's exactly why it was considered dangerous. Stanley Kubrick sets the story far from the front lines, inside marble halls and polished offices where decisions are made without consequence. Orders are given calmly, maps are studied, lives are moved like pieces on a board. The soldiers, meanwhile, are asked to do the impossible, charge an unwinnable position, advance into certain death. Not for strategy, not for victory, but to protect the pride of men who will never leave their desks. What makes Paths of Glory unsettling isn't the battlefield, it's the logic behind it. When the mission fails, the system doesn't admit error. Instead, it looks for someone to blame. 3 soldiers are selected at random, not because they were cowards, not because they disobeyed orders, but because an example needs to be made. The courtroom scenes are colder than any trench. There is no real defense, no illusion of justice, only procedure pretending to be morality. And that was the line this film crossed. By portraying military authority as bureaucratic, self-preserving, and indifferent to human life, Paths of Glory shattered the idea that war failures are tragic accidents. It suggested something far more uncomfortable, that injustice can be deliberate, routine, even polite. That message was enough to get the film banned in France for nearly 2 decades. Not because it insulted soldiers, but because it questioned the institution that commanded them. Even today, the film feels sharp, modern, almost too relevant. Kubrick doesn't argue that war is chaotic. He argues that it can be orderly, and that this order is what allows cruelty to function without guilt. By the time the final scene arrives, quiet, restrained, and devastating, the film makes its point without raising its voice. War doesn't just destroy bodies, it rewards obedience over conscience. And if that truth felt unacceptable in 1957, the next film on this list would push that discomfort even further. Number 4. The Battle of Algiers, 1966. The Battle of Algiers doesn't feel like a movie, it feels like evidence. Shot in stark black and white, with handheld cameras and non-professional actors, the film looks less like cinema and more like recovered footage. There are no sweeping musical cues, no dramatic speeches, just events unfolding with an unsettling calm. The story follows the Algerian struggle for independence, but it refuses to give the audience a comfortable position. There is no clear hero, no single villain, only actions, reactions, and consequences that spiral outward. Bombings happen in crowded streets, raids happen in the middle of the night. Civilians are caught in between, often without warning, often without choice. What makes the film so disturbing is its neutrality. It does not celebrate rebellion. It does not glorify control. It simply shows how violence becomes normalized when it is justified as necessary. And that was precisely the problem. When the film was released, it was banned in France for years, not because it was inaccurate, but because it was too recognizable, too close to wounds that hadn't healed yet. The film exposed tactics that governments preferred to keep abstract: interrogations, surveillance, collective punishment, all presented without commentary, leaving the audience to sit with the implications. There is no emotional release here, no moment where order is truly restored. Each act of control creates resistance. Each act of resistance invites harsher control. Violence doesn't escalate dramatically, it escalates administratively. That's what makes the Battle of Algiers so enduring. It doesn't argue that war is evil. It shows how war becomes procedural, how cruelty can be systematized until it feels routine. Decades later, the film is still studied in military and political institutions, not as a warning, but as a manual. And that irony says everything. If Paths of Glory revealed how injustice is justified from above, the next film on this list shows what happens when war descends fully into madness and no one pretends to be rational anymore. Number 3. Apocalypse Now, 1979. Most war films try to impose order on chaos. Apocalypse Now does the opposite. It lets the chaos spread. From the opening moments, the film makes one thing clear. This is not a story about winning a war. It's about losing your grip on reality or pretending everything is under control. The mission itself sounds simple. Travel upriver, find a rogue officer, terminate him. But nothing about the journey feels logical. The deeper the characters move into the jungle, the more the rules dissolve. Military discipline becomes performance. Strategy turns into ritual. Violence starts to feel casual, almost bored. What makes Apocalypse Now so unsettling is how normal the madness appears. Helicopters attack villages to the sound of classical music. Soldiers surf while shells explode nearby. Entire communities are destroyed, then immediately forgotten. There is no moral anchor here, no clear line between right and wrong, only momentum. The film suggests that war doesn't corrupt people suddenly, it erodes them slowly, through repetition, through permission, through the constant reassurance that someone else is responsible. When the story reaches its final act, it doesn't offer answers, it offers atmosphere, darkness, confusion, a sense that something has gone irreversibly wrong, not just in this mission, but in the logic that created it. That's why the film was so controversial when it was released. Not because it showed violence, but because it stripped away the illusion that violence had purpose. Many audiences expected a statement about Vietnam. What they got instead was something more disturbing, a portrait of how power loses meaning when it operates without accountability. Even today, Apocalypse Now feels dangerous, not loud, not aggressive, dangerous in the way it refuses to guide the viewer toward comfort. It doesn't tell you what to think about war, it simply immerses you in what war feels like when it has gone on too long and no one remembers why it started. If the Battle of Algiers showed how violence becomes procedural, this film shows what happens when procedure collapses and madness is allowed to pass for leadership. And yet, as disturbing as that descent is, the next film on this list goes even further, because it removes ideology entirely and leaves only the experience of terror itself. Number 2. Come and See, 1985. Most war films rely on perspective, a soldier, a unit, a mission. Come and See takes all of that away. The film is told almost entirely through the eyes of a child. Not a symbol, not an innocent observer meant to inspire hope, just a boy who is slowly, visibly destroyed by what he witnesses. There is no traditional plot here, no sense of progression toward victory or defeat. Events simply happen, and each one takes something away that can never be returned. What makes Come and See unbearable isn't what it shows, but how it shows it. The camera lingers on faces for too long, on fear that has nowhere to go, on confusion that never turns into understanding. Gunshots come without warning, screams fade into silence, entire villages vanish in a matter of minutes, and the film never allows the viewer to process it properly. There is almost no music guiding your emotions, no editing rhythm to create distance. You are trapped inside the experience, forced to watch the same way the child does, without context, without explanation, without control. That realism made the film nearly impossible to distribute when it was first released. In the Soviet Union, it was quietly restricted, not officially banned, but rarely promoted, rarely screened, because this was not a film that could be celebrated, or quoted, or turned into national pride. It offered no ideology, no justification, no enemy worth hating, only the raw sensation of terror, helplessness, and loss. By the final act, the child no longer looks like a child. His face is aged, hollow, unrecognizable, and that transformation is the film's entire argument. War doesn't need years to destroy a person. Sometimes it only needs a few days. Come and See is not a film people recommend casually. It is something you endure once and carry with you afterward. If Apocalypse Now showed the madness of power unchecked, this film removes power entirely and shows what war looks like to those who have none. And somehow, the final film on this list is even quieter. because it shows that you don't have to be on the battlefield at all to be completely devastated by war. Number 1. Grave of the Fireflies, 1988. There are no battlefields in Grave of the Fireflies, no generals, no strategies, no victories, and that is exactly why it is one of the most devastating anti-war films ever made. The story follows two siblings trying to survive in Japan during the final months of World War II. They don't fight the enemy, they don't understand politics, they don't even fully understand the war itself. They are simply trying to eat, to sleep, to stay together. What makes the film unbearable is how ordinary everything feels. Air raids interrupt daily routines, food shortages become normal, suffering arrives quietly without dramatic build-up. There is no single moment where everything collapses. Things just slowly get worse and worse. And then, irreversible. Because the film is animated, many people once assumed it was meant for children. That misunderstanding kept it out of theatres, classrooms, and discussions for years. Not officially banned in the traditional sense, but quietly sidelined, deemed too depressing to show widely. Yet animation is what allows the film to be so precise, so restrained, so cruel in its honesty. The characters don't die in heroic ways. They fade, they weaken, they are forgotten by a society too overwhelmed to care. There is no villain to blame, no enemy face to focus your anger on. The war itself is distant, almost invisible, and that's the point. Grave of the Fireflies argues that war doesn't need to target you directly. It only needs to exist. Its consequences will find you anyway. By the time the film ends, there is no shock left, only exhaustion, and a quiet understanding that nothing shown here was exaggerated. This is why the film lingers longer than any other on this list. Not because it is graphic, but because it removes every excuse we use to tolerate war. It doesn't ask you to judge history, it asks you to sit with the cost. And once you do, it becomes very hard to believe that any war is ever worth remembering as a victory. War films like these don't linger because they are shocking. They linger because they refuse to make suffering feel meaningful. What they expose isn't just the brutality of war, but how quickly pain becomes acceptable once it's labeled necessary, strategic, or historical. And maybe that's the part that unsettles us most. Not that these films were banned, restricted, or quietly forgotten, but that time eventually proved them right. Because if certain stories were once considered too dangerous to show, too destabilizing to remember, it forces a harder question into the present. What versions of war are we still being taught to accept simply because they're easier to live with than the truth?